So in part 1 of this lesson, we started talking about the regulations that govern venture capital. Specifically, we took a look at the registration requirements with the SEC. Let's keep the ball rolling and talk about the second important item, exemptions. So, same deal, right back to our list here. We're looking at exemptions in 3 key categories: the fund advisor, and the fundraising process. And before we dive into the first one, let's turn back the clock for a quick second and remember something that we talked about a while back. Remember a few lessons ago when we talked about how a VC fund is legally defined? There were those 5 bullet points, right? And on bullet point 5, we said, hey, don't worry about this right now. We're going to talk about that later. Well, guess what? It's later, and we're going to talk about it. So, to recap what that bullet point said, if you want to be legally defined as a venture capital fund, then a venture capital fund cannot be registered as an investment company under the Investment Company Act. You with me? I'm going to say that again. If you want to be legally defined as a VC fund, then the fund can't be registered as an investment company, which is kind of like weird, right? The question is, how do you do that? How do you create a fund but not register it as an investment company? And this is exactly where our fund exemptions come in. Remember that law we talked about a while back, the Investment Company Act of 1940? Well, under this law, there are 2 main ways a fund can be exempt from registering as a, quote, investment company with the SEC. So let's run through both of those exemptions. They are a Section 3C1 exemption and a Section 3C7 exemption. First up, let's take a look at 3C1. When you look at a Section 3C1 fund, you got to think about how it applies to all types of private funds versus just venture capital funds. So let's go big first and do all types of private funds. A private fund is going to qualify for the 3C1 exemption if it meets 2 requirements. 1, it doesn't offer securities publicly, aka it's not listed on the public stock market. And 2, it's not owned by more than 100, quote, beneficial owners. So to say that again, you can't list the company publicly, and you gotta have less than 100 of these things called beneficial owners. So, what is a beneficial owner? Well, beneficial owners are people or institutions who literally stand to benefit from ownership in the fund, which is kind of like no duh, right? So let's see what that means in real life. If we look back at our fund structure here, remember how the fund collects money from all of those investors, or LPs? Well, if the LP is an individual person, then they count as one beneficial owner. But if the LP is a bigger entity, or like an institution or what have you, then it would count as more than one. So it all just depends on the different rules that are spelled out by the SEC. So real quick recap. If your fund wants to seek this exemption, 3C1, then the fund can't list publicly, and it can't have more than 100 beneficial owners. If both of these criteria are met, then you might be getting into exemption territory, meaning you might be able to avoid registering as a, quote, investment company, meaning you might be legally allowed to call your fund a venture capital fund. You still with me? You're doing great. Now, there's another ingredient we haven't talked about yet that becomes kind of important here. In order to even invest in your fund in the first place, those LPs also have to be this thing we call accredited investors. So, what's an accredited investor? Let's talk about it. To understand what an accredited investor is, you first got to remember, investing in private companies is super risky. If it's a public company, like say Apple or Google, then the company has to report their financials to the public. So if you're an average Joe, you have access to public information that can help you make smart investment decisions. But if you think about it, private companies are kind of different, right? With private companies, the financials aren't out there publicly, which means it's a way riskier type of investment to make. If you're an average Joe trying to invest in a private fund, for example, you don't have access to the fund's financials, unless the fund chooses to share that info with you. So at the end of the day, there's just a lot more risk involved when you invest in private companies, and it can be a lot more dangerous for the average person. So the SEC has protections in place to make sure you're qualified for these more risky types of private investments. And that's what an accredited investor is. Accredited investors are people or entities who meet certain requirements. They have a certain amount of wealth, or they have professional certifications. Maybe they have specific investment knowledge, or a certain amount of assets. Basically, the SEC uses these requirements as different ways to measure the sophistication of the investor. So if someone decides to invest in your private fund, then the question is, are they qualified to make that decision intelligently? If so, they're defined as an accredited investor. Whew, okay, stick with me, we're almost done. So we talked about how any private fund can seek exemption under 3C1, right? But if a fund means the definition of a qualifying venture capital fund, then it can actually rely on a special exemption that's inside of 3C1 that's a tiny bit more flexible. Basically, here's how it works. Under this special exemption, if the fund is a venture capital fund, then the required number of beneficial owners goes from 100 all the way to 250. So we're talking about 250 investors instead of just 100. But there's a catch. In order to still stay exempt, the VC fund has to raise $10 million or less. Look, I know, all of this stuff can be brutally complicated, but if you're raising a fund and managing potentially millions of dollars for people, it's pretty helpful to know the details of what you're doing. If you take away anything from this lesson, let it be this. Registering with the SEC is important, but it also comes with a lot of responsibilities and expenses. So if you're going to be exempt from registering, then there's really specific criteria that you're going to have to meet. We just went through the first piece of that criteria, the Section 3C1 exemption for your fund. In the next lesson, we're going to finish up that second part, Section 3C7 exemption, and then go into other exemptions. So take a breather, shake the cobwebs out, and then when you're ready, hit the button below and let's keep learning.